This story is a work of historical fiction inspired by mysteries, legends, and creative imagination. The characters, events, and descriptions are created for entertainment purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or real events is purely coincidental. The narrative explores themes of time, mystery, and the unexplained, and is not intended to present factual or scientific evidence. The turn of the century brought new wonders to Ashbourne. The arrival of the telegraph, the slow replacement of oil lamps with electric lights, and the hum of trains echoing in the distance. Yet for all these changes, one thing remained untouched: Elizabeth Caldwell. By now, she had lived in Ashbourne for nearly 4 decades. Those who had first met her in 1863 were either gone or elderly, but Elizabeth looked no older than the day she had arrived. The younger generations grew up hearing her name spoken in hushed tones. Parents warned children not to stare when they saw her walking to the market, her steps measured and graceful, her face serene, framed by the same chestnut-brown hair she had carried since her youth. Whispers followed her wherever she went. At first, the gossip was curious rather than cruel. Young women envied her complexion and wondered if she used some secret cream imported from Paris. Men, though wary, could not help but marvel at her beauty. But as the years stretched into decades, admiration turned into unease. When grandmothers realized Elizabeth looked younger than their granddaughters, when priests noticed she had outlived 3 generations of congregants without a wrinkle, unease turned into suspicion. "She walks with the devil," one villager muttered outside the church. "No, she drinks the blood of children," another whispered by the fire. "Perhaps she is not a woman at all," an old man said one night at the tavern, his voice low, "but a spirit wearing human flesh." The rumors grew darker with time. Every misfortune, no matter how unrelated, seemed to circle back to her. When a barn burned, some said Elizabeth had cursed the farmer after he refused her request for lumber. When livestock died suddenly, people whispered she had poisoned the well. Even the harsh winter storms were sometimes laid at her feet, as though her very presence disturbed the balance of nature. Elizabeth endured these rumors with a kind of weary patience. She still helped neighbors in need, tending to the sick and sewing clothes for orphans. But kindness did little to silence suspicion. People accepted her aid with gratitude, but afterward, they crossed themselves or whispered prayers under their breath. By the 1880s, a new kind of attention began to reach Ashbourne. Word of the woman who did not age traveled beyond the town. Scholars, doctors, and men of curiosity made the journey to see her with their own eyes. They knocked on her door, asking questions in the name of science. Most of them left with more questions than answers. One physician, Dr. Henry Larkins, wrote in his notes after examining her in 1884, "Her pulse is steady, her eyes bright, her faculties as sharp as any woman of 25. I can find no evidence of decay. If she is indeed the age the townsfolk claim, then I am faced with a phenomenon nature cannot explain. She is as though time itself has chosen to leave her untouched." But doctors were not the only ones drawn to her. Occultists, too, came calling. In the 1890s, a man dressed in black, calling himself a student of the arcane, sought her out and demanded she reveal the secret of her immortality. Elizabeth denied knowing any secret. When she refused him entry, he left a crude symbol carved into her door, a warning, or perhaps a curse. Despite the growing scrutiny, Elizabeth never abandoned Ashbourne. She could have disappeared, fled to a distant city where no one knew her, but she remained. Perhaps she hoped that staying in one place would make her less of a spectacle. Or perhaps she was simply tired of running from herself. It was the children who both feared and adored her the most. Some dared each other to run up to her gate and shout her name. Others left small offerings, flowers, shiny stones, even scraps of bread, believing her to be a fairy in disguise. Elizabeth often smiled at them, though behind her smile lingered sadness. She longed for the days when she might have been a mother herself, but she had denied herself that chance, terrified of what it would mean to watch her own children grow old while she remained unchanged. By the dawn of the new century, Elizabeth had become a paradox. She was both revered and reviled, a source of fascination and fear. People avoided her, yet they could not stop speaking of her. She was seen as a blessing by some, a curse by others, and a miracle by none who knew her best. The whispers never stopped. If anything, they grew louder. And though Elizabeth kept her silence, her diary tells us she heard every one. In an entry from 1902, she wrote, "They call me a witch, a demon, a vessel of sin. Yet I am none of these. I am only a woman who wishes for peace. But peace is denied me, for my very being offends the laws of nature. I ask God each night for answers, but the heavens remain silent." Still, life in Ashbourne moved on. Children grew up, couples married, and generations passed in the blink of an eye. For everyone but Elizabeth Caldwell. She walked among them like a ghost in daylight, caught between life and eternity. What the townsfolk did not know was that Elizabeth's story was only just beginning. The whispers in the shadows were about to give way to something much larger, something that would carry her name far beyond Ashbourne, into the realm of science, legend, and myth. The 20th century arrived with the sound of machinery, the smoke of factories, and the restless march of progress. Yet, in the midst of all this change, Elizabeth Caldwell remained constant, a figure frozen in time while the world aged around her. By 1910, Ashbourne had transformed. Trains brought travelers from distant cities, and new inventions like the telephone and electric lamps reached even the most isolated towns. Families who had once lived in stone cottages now dreamed of automobiles and gramophones. The children who had whispered about Elizabeth at the turn of the century were now parents themselves, raising children who also whispered about her. But Elizabeth did not change. She looked as though she had just stepped into town yesterday, her hair still rich, her skin untouched by age, her eyes glimmering with that same timeless depth. By then, she had lived among the people of Ashbourne for nearly 50 years without a single wrinkle. This continuity was no longer merely local gossip. Word spread wider, carried on newspapers, and whispers passed from traveler to traveler. Writers and journalists began to mention her in articles about strange phenomena. Some mocked the idea, dismissing her as a hoax. Others were enthralled, believing her to be proof that the human body might one day defeat death itself. But for Elizabeth, such attention was more curse than blessing. She had long ago stopped attending social gatherings, no longer daring to stand beside those she once called friends. It was too painful to watch them grow frail while she remained unchanged. When they died, their children sometimes avoided her entirely, fearful of the strange figure who had outlived their parents and their grandparents too. By the time the Great War broke out in 1914, Elizabeth had already buried 3 generations of neighbors. She mourned each loss quietly, though the world thought her incapable of grief. In her diary she confessed, "It is I who carry the heaviest grief. Every farewell is mine to endure. I am cursed to remember what others may forget. And so, as the world burns in war, I too burn, but silently, eternally." Her life during the war was both tragic and remarkable. When young men of Ashbourne marched away to the front, Elizabeth worked tirelessly as a nurse, tending to the wounded in makeshift hospitals. She stitched wounds, calmed fevered soldiers, and comforted those who would not live to see another dawn. To the suffering men, her presence was almost otherworldly, a woman untouched by time, kneeling at their bedsides as though an angel had come to them in their last hours. After the war ended and Ashbourne buried its sons, Elizabeth once again retreated into obscurity. Yet she could not fully escape notice. As decades passed, her continued agelessness became harder to ignore. In the 1920s, a journalist from London visited Ashbourne and wrote a sensational article titled, "The Woman Who Defies Time, a Living Mystery in Ashbourne." The piece caused a stir, drawing more outsiders to seek her out. Some came with curiosity, others with greed. A wealthy industrialist once offered her a fortune if she would reveal her secret. A doctor promised her protection in exchange for letting him conduct discreet experiments. Even a group of spiritualists claimed she was the reincarnation of a goddess. Elizabeth refused them all, but her refusals did not stop the flow of speculation. In fact, they only made the mystery deeper. By mid-century, Elizabeth was no longer just a local legend. She was becoming a global enigma. Scholars argued about her in universities. Clerics debated whether she was a miracle or a sin. Governments quietly began to take interest, their agents keeping watch from the shadows. Meanwhile, Elizabeth lived through history's darkest chapters. She watched the rise of fascism, the horrors of World War II, and the atomic age. In each era, she remained hidden in plain sight, helping quietly, healing quietly, grieving quietly. While others perished, she endured, her face unmarked by the years. And yet, her endurance was not without suffering. With every decade, loneliness grew heavier. The small joys of life, friendship, love, family, slipped further from her grasp. Each time she grew close to someone, she was forced to withdraw or watch them age and die. She denied herself marriage, denied herself children, and denied herself the very human need for belonging. One diary entry from 1947 reads, "I have lived 84 years in Ashbourne, yet I am as young as the day I arrived. They think it a gift, but I tell you it is a prison. What use is a life without an end? The world shifts like sand, but I remain stone. To remain unchanged while all else falls into ruin. This is the cruelest fate of all." Despite her sorrow, Elizabeth could not escape fascination. In the 1950s, rumors suggested she had been approached by government officials. Some claimed they wanted to study her for the sake of science. Others whispered she was offered protection in exchange for cooperation. But Elizabeth avoided such entanglements, vanishing from public sight whenever she sensed too much attention. Still, she could not vanish entirely. Her presence, recorded in photographs and town records spanning decades, provided undeniable evidence. In one newspaper archive, a photograph from 1905 showed her at a charity event, her youthful face bright and serene. Next to it, a photograph from 1955 captured her at the very same cottage gate, unchanged, as though half a century had never passed. Generations came and went. Elizabeth became a legend whispered at bedtime, a myth teachers used to spark curiosity, a ghost story that no one could fully dismiss. Children grew up fearing her, then grew old remembering her, then passed away while she remained. And through it all, Elizabeth Caldwell walked quietly through history, the ageless woman who bore witness to humanity's rise and fall. She lived not as a goddess or a demon, but as a lonely traveler burdened by eternity. Yet still, no answer had come. Not from science, not from faith, not from time itself. By the middle of the 20th century, Elizabeth Caldwell had lived through more lifetimes than she cared to count. She had seen the rise and fall of empires, the destruction of wars, the advancement of technology, and the shifting tides of culture. Yet in all this change, she remained a fixed point, a silent witness to history, unchanged in body if not in spirit. For those who heard her story, the question was always the same. Was her condition a blessing or a curse? To strangers, she seemed blessed beyond comprehension. Who would not wish to live forever in the prime of youth? To never wrinkle, to never weaken, to never watch the body fail? In an age when people feared disease, aging, and death, Elizabeth seemed to embody the dream of immortality. Scientists whispered of medical revolutions, priests pondered divine miracles, and opportunists imagined wealth and power. But for Elizabeth herself, the truth was far darker. She carried her existence like a weight, one that grew heavier with every passing decade. Each friend she made, she lost. Each family she came to know, she buried. Every bond she dared to form turned into pain when time stole them away, leaving her behind. She had loved once, deeply, fiercely, but the sight of her beloved husband growing old while she remained unchanged had broken something inside her. Since then, she had kept her heart guarded, unwilling to let another soul close enough to hurt her again. Her diary from 1963 captured this torment with stark clarity. "The world sees me as a marvel, a wonder, but they do not understand. To live without change is to live without meaning. Birth, growth, decay, death. These are the rhythms of life, and I am cut off from them all. They call it a gift. I call it exile." Still, she could not deny that there were moments when she wondered if perhaps it was a gift. She had survived every plague that swept through Ashbourne, every war that scarred the world. She had seen the beauty of centuries unfold. Art, music, literature, discoveries that changed the very shape of existence. She had walked beneath gas lamps and neon lights, listened to orchestras and radios, watched horses give way to automobiles and airplanes. Few people could claim to have seen so much. And yet, each glimpse of wonder was shadowed by the truth. She experienced it all alone. In the 1970s, Elizabeth found herself increasingly drawn into philosophical and spiritual circles. She quietly attended lectures, read the works of mystics and monks, and even spent time in monasteries where the monks accepted her without question. She sought answers to the question that haunted her. Why me? One monk told her. You see eternity as a curse because you cling to the world of beginnings and endings. But perhaps you were chosen to walk between them, to bear witness. Not all souls are meant to follow the same path. His words gave her pause, but not peace. Elizabeth yearned for closure, for an ending that never came. Others saw her as something supernatural. Occultists pursued her, convinced she was proof of ancient secrets. Some believed she had found the philosopher's stone. Others swore she was a witch who had bargained with the devil. A few even worshipped her, calling her a goddess of time. Elizabeth rejected all of them, though their attention never ceased. Meanwhile, scientists grew bolder. By the 1980s, advances in genetics and medicine made Elizabeth an object of fascination. Whispers circulated that governments had tried to collect samples of her blood. Rumors said her DNA had been analyzed, yet revealed nothing extraordinary. Every test showed her to be perfectly, maddeningly normal. No mutations, no abnormalities, no scientific explanation for why she had not aged a day since 1863. Elizabeth began to feel hunted. The very thing she had tried to keep secret had now made her a target. Her diary entries grew darker, more fearful. They think I hold the key to immortality. They do not understand that it is not a gift to give, but a burden to endure. If they could walk a single year in my eternity, they would beg for release. Still, not all her encounters were sinister. Some people she met in these decades offered her comfort. A young woman she befriended in the 1990s told her, "You may never age, Elizabeth, but that doesn't mean you don't live. Perhaps your purpose is to remind us that life is precious, whether it lasts a century or forever." The words touched Elizabeth, though she struggled to believe them. To her, the endless years blurred together, and the weight of memory grew unbearable. Every face she had loved was gone, and she alone carried the burden of remembering them all. As the new millennium approached, Elizabeth found herself standing on the edge of 2 centuries. She had lived through the Victorian age, the industrial age, the wars, the atomic age, the rise of technology, and now she watched the dawn of the digital era. Children carried computers in their pockets. The world connected through invisible signals, and mankind reached farther into the stars. She marveled at the speed of progress, yet felt increasingly out of place. In the quiet of her cottage, surrounded by books and memories, she often asked herself if she had been meant to witness all this, or if she had simply been forgotten by time itself. Was she cursed or chosen? The answer remained elusive. Science could not explain her. Faith offered only riddles, and time itself remained silent. And so Elizabeth Caldwell continued her lonely walk through history, caught between gift and curse, blessing and exile, her story no closer to resolution than the day it began. By the dawn of the 21st century, Elizabeth Caldwell was no longer just a whispered legend in a small English town. She had become an anomaly that science could not ignore. With every decade that passed, her existence pushed against the boundaries of what medicine, biology, and physics understood. For years, Elizabeth had managed to avoid direct involvement with researchers. But as technology advanced, so too did the persistence of those who sought her out. By the early 2000s, stories of the ageless woman of Ashbourne had become a topic in obscure scientific journals, conspiracy forums, and even late-night talk shows. Most dismissed her story as folklore. But the photographs, those hauntingly consistent images of a woman who appeared unchanged across more than a century, were harder to deny. Elizabeth herself lived quietly in a cottage hidden behind ivy and hedges. But she could not remain invisible forever. In 2005, a team of geneticists convinced her, after months of letters and reassurances, to let them conduct tests. They swore confidentiality and promised not to reduce her to a laboratory specimen. Reluctantly, Elizabeth agreed. Blood samples were drawn, tissue swabs taken, advanced imaging performed. For weeks, machines analyzed her biology at the molecular level. The scientists were ecstatic, certain they would uncover some mutation or genetic quirk that explained her timeless body. But when the results came back, the team was left baffled. Her blood was normal. Her cells aged at a microscopic level, dividing and repairing themselves like anyone else's. There was no unusual mutation in her telomeres, no sign of enhanced regeneration, no biological mechanism that could explain her condition. Her DNA matched the pattern of any ordinary human being. One of the lead researchers reportedly wrote in his private notes, "She is impossible. Every test tells us she should age, and yet she does not. We are staring at a paradox, an ordinary genome producing an extraordinary reality. It is as if the laws of biology simply refuse to apply to her." When Elizabeth asked them if they had found an answer, the scientists admitted they had not. She smiled faintly, as though she had expected nothing else. "Then you know how I feel," she told them softly. "For 150 years, I too have been searching for an answer. But science is never content with mystery." News of her cooperation leaked, despite promises of secrecy. Soon, more institutions requested her participation. Some offered generous sums of money. Others hinted that refusing them might not be in her best interest. Elizabeth, realizing she had stepped too close to the spotlight, withdrew once again. She moved to a different town under a false name, leaving behind only questions and speculation. Still, the pursuit never ended. In the years that followed, more sophisticated technologies emerged. Genetic sequencing became faster, imaging more precise, databases more comprehensive. Rumors spread that shadowy government programs had secretly tracked her, compiling their own classified research. Some whispered that she had been approached by pharmaceutical companies desperate to find in her veins the secret to eternal youth. Elizabeth's diaries from this time reveal her growing frustration. "They treat me as though I am a key to unlock their greed. But I am no key. I am a locked door with no handle, no entrance, no exit. If they knew the sorrow I carry, they would not call it immortality. They would call it imprisonment." And yet, despite her bitterness, Elizabeth occasionally allowed herself to wonder, what if science could explain her? What if there was an answer buried in her biology that she herself could not see? Would that knowledge free her, or would it only bind her more tightly to the world that would never let her go? In 2010, one daring neurologist suggested that perhaps the key did not lie in her body at all, but in the very fabric of time. He proposed that Elizabeth was not merely ageless, but unstuck from the ordinary flow of temporal reality. His theory was dismissed by colleagues as fanciful speculation. Yet, for Elizabeth, the idea struck a chord. Sometimes she too felt as though she was not truly part of the world, but rather hovering just outside it, present, yet not fully bound by its laws. Scientists, philosophers, and mystics debated endlessly, but none came closer to the truth. Every explanation dissolved into mystery. Was she a genetic outlier? A divine miracle? A cosmic mistake? Or something the human mind was simply not equipped to understand? As for Elizabeth, she grew increasingly weary of their questions. The more the world sought answers, the more she longed for silence. In the quiet of her home, surrounded by stacks of journals, she wrote, "They call me a mystery, but I am simply a question without an answer. Science dissects me, faith interprets me, but neither truly sees me. I am not a phenomenon. I am a woman, a lonely, wandering woman who longs for the same thing all mortals long for, peace." Despite her protests, her name never fully disappeared from the fringes of science. Researchers continued to argue about her in conferences and papers. Some declared her a hoax. Others, though fewer, whispered that she was the most important discovery humanity had yet to make. But Elizabeth Caldwell remained what she had always been, a paradox that science could not solve, a woman who walked through centuries untouched, her story hovering between myth and reality. And though the world clamored for answers, Elizabeth herself knew the truth. There were none to give. For all the years Elizabeth Caldwell lived in silence, it was her diaries that told the truest story of her life. Stacked neatly in her cottage, bound in worn leather and faded ribbon, they were her only companions through the centuries. Each diary was filled with her careful handwriting, page after page of reflections, fears, confessions, and observations. The townsfolk had always whispered about the strange books she kept. Some said they contained spells. Others claimed they were records of her dark bargains with the devil. But when, at last, fragments of her diaries were discovered, they revealed something far more human, an unending chronicle of love, grief, and longing. One of the earliest surviving entries, dated 1865, read, "I do not know why I remain unchanged. I thought at first it was a passing illusion, but now I see it is real. I live as though trapped in amber. Others wither, I do not. I am frightened." As the years unfolded, her writings became both more detailed and more sorrowful. She wrote of friends she loved dearly, of watching them grow old, of the funerals she attended with a face that never matched the grief in her eyes. She wrote of the ache of loneliness, of nights spent weeping into her pillow, of prayers whispered into the dark without answer. And yet, her diaries were not only filled with despair. There were also moments of wonder. She described her joy at hearing Beethoven played live for the first time, her awe at seeing the Eiffel Tower rise in Paris, her amazement at watching a man land on the moon through a black-and-white television. Each entry captured the rhythm of human progress through the eyes of someone who never changed. By the late 20th century, the diaries had become almost prophetic in tone. Elizabeth seemed to sense that her writings were not only for herself, but for future generations who might one day discover them. In 1989, she wrote, "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, or perhaps I have chosen to leave these words behind. Know this, my story is not of magic or miracle. It is of sorrow, endurance, and unanswered questions. Do not envy me. My eternity is not freedom, it is solitude." When a small portion of her diaries eventually came to light, historians and scholars were stunned. They offered a first-hand account of more than a century of human history, wars, revolutions, inventions, and cultural shifts, described not by generations of voices, but by a single, consistent perspective. The authenticity of the diaries was fiercely debated, but those who read them could not deny their emotional truth. The most haunting aspect of her writings was her honesty. She did not write to convince anyone of her condition. She wrote to unburden her soul. Every page bared her humanity, the part the world seemed to overlook in its obsession with her agelessness. In one late entry, she summed up her life with devastating simplicity. "I am Elizabeth Caldwell. I was born, but I do not age. I have lived 1,000 lives in one body, but none of them have been truly mine. My story is not about how I have defeated time. It is about how time has defeated me again and again by taking from me everyone I have ever loved." Her diaries became the clearest window into the heart of the woman who never aged. And though they answered no scientific questions, they revealed the truth of her humanity, a truth more profound than any laboratory could uncover. By the year 2025, Elizabeth Caldwell could no longer remain hidden. The world had changed too much, and secrecy had become nearly impossible in the age of the internet, surveillance, and instant communication. Her story, once whispered in small towns and obscure journals, was now the subject of documentaries, podcasts, and countless online theories. Some dismissed her as myth. Others insisted she was the greatest scientific mystery of all time. Photographs spanning more than a century, showing the same youthful face, circulated online. Though skeptics called them fabrications, the evidence was too consistent to ignore. Elizabeth herself had grown weary of running. For over 160 years, she had hidden in shadows, moving when attention became too sharp, erasing her trail, living under false names. But now, at last, she chose to step into the light. It began with a journalist, a persistent woman named Claire Morgan, who had spent years piecing together fragments of Elizabeth's life. She tracked her movements across decades, uncovered records under dozens of names, and finally found the small house where Elizabeth lived in quiet seclusion. When Claire knocked, Elizabeth did not turn her away. Over cups of tea in a sunlit kitchen, Elizabeth told her story, not the myths, not the rumors, but her truth. She spoke of arriving in Ashbourne in 1863, of realizing she did not age, of the grief that haunted her as she buried generations of friends and loved ones. She spoke of the endless questions, the scientists, the occultists, the governments, and how none had brought her closer to an answer. Claire listened, recording every word. knowing she was witnessing history. Yet she was struck not by the miracle of Elizabeth's existence, but by the humanity in her voice, the pain, the longing, the vulnerability. "Will you let the world see you?" Claire asked at last. Elizabeth was silent for a long time. Then she shook her head. "The world has enough myths. Let them keep me as one. If they knew me, truly knew me, they would see not wonder, but sorrow." The interview was never published. Claire honored Elizabeth's wish, keeping the tape sealed. All that remained was the knowledge that, somewhere, the ageless woman still lived. And so, Elizabeth Caldwell chose once again to vanish. In the spring of 2025, she left her cottage, leaving behind only her diaries and a single note: "Do not look for me. I have no answers. My story belongs not to science, nor to faith, but to mystery. Let it remain so." Elizabeth Caldwell's disappearance in 2025 only deepened the enigma. With no trace left behind except her diaries and the faint memory of her presence, she became more legend than woman. Scientists, historians, journalists, and even conspiracy theorists debated her fate endlessly, each clinging to a different explanation. Some believed she had simply chosen exile once more, slipping into another identity as she had so many times before. Others insisted she had finally found a way to end her unnatural existence, an escape she had sought for more than a century. A few even whispered that she had never been human at all, but something beyond comprehension, a messenger, a curse, or a living reminder of mysteries time could never unravel. The diaries, now preserved in archives, became the most studied documents of the modern era. Universities analyzed them line by line, hoping to find hidden clues in her handwriting. Psychologists saw them as a record of trauma, while philosophers regarded them as testimony to the unbearable weight of eternity. Yet the more the world searched for answers, the more questions arose. What force had kept Elizabeth unchanged? Why her and no one else? Was it science waiting to be discovered, or a truth beyond human grasp? No test, no theory, no belief could provide certainty. And perhaps that was the greatest part of her story, the reminder that not everything in life, or in time, can be explained. But beyond the speculation, Elizabeth's true legacy lay not in her mystery, but in her humanity. The pages she left behind revealed a woman who laughed, wept, loved, and suffered like anyone else. A woman who had lived through centuries, yet longed only for connection, for understanding, for peace. For many, her story became a lesson that eternal youth was not a gift to covet, but a burden to endure. A lesson that life's beauty lies not in escaping time, but in embracing it. And so Elizabeth Caldwell faded from the world, but not from memory. She became a ghost in history books, a whisper in lectures, a subject of novels and films. Yet beneath all the myth, one truth endured: she had lived. She had loved. She had left behind a mystery that science could not solve and humanity could not forget. Perhaps she still walks among us, unchanged as ever, blending into the crowd with the same timeless face. Or perhaps she has vanished into some final silence beyond reach. Either way, Elizabeth Caldwell remains what she always was, the woman who never aged, the mystery that time itself could not explain. Long after Elizabeth Caldwell's last recorded appearance, the world moved forward. New generations were born, new technologies reshaped human life, and the mysteries of the past faded into half-forgotten archives. Yet her name endured, not as a scientific case study or a medical anomaly, but as a symbol of humanity's endless search for answers. In quiet libraries, her diaries remained locked behind glass, scholars still requesting access, still debating the fine ink strokes of her handwriting. Each sentence was parsed for hidden meaning, as though the secret of her agelessness might be coded in metaphor. But the truth was always the same. She had no explanation to give. Children learned her name in whispers, told as a ghost story or a cautionary tale. The woman who never aged became a bedtime myth, woven with fear and wonder. Some believed meeting her was a blessing, others warned it was a curse. Yet in every telling, there was always the image of Elizabeth walking through time untouched, her eyes carrying centuries of sorrow. From time to time, rumors would resurface. A photograph taken in a crowded city. A video clip of a woman with her same face, crossing a street in the background. a nurse who swore she treated a patient who looked exactly like her, though the patient vanished before morning. These claims were impossible to prove, but they kept her story alive. For scientists, Elizabeth remained the greatest unsolved mystery in biology. For philosophers, she was proof that existence contained truths beyond human logic. For poets, she was the perfect muse, a woman trapped between eternity and loneliness. And perhaps that was the ultimate answer. There was no answer. The story of Elizabeth Caldwell endured not because it could be explained, but because it could not. Her existence challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be alive, to change, to age, to belong to time. In the end, whether she still walked among humanity or had finally found her peace, one truth remained. She had left behind more questions than she had ever been able to answer. 2.